Welcome to the Sober Living Stories podcast. This podcast is dedicated to sharing stories of sobriety. We shine a spotlight on individuals who have faced the challenges of alcoholism and addiction and are today living out their best lives sober. Each guest has experienced incredible transformation and are here to share their story with you. I'm Jessica Stepanovic, your host. Join me each week as guests from all walks of life share their stories to inspire and provide hope to those who need it most. Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Sober Living Stories podcast. My guest today is Janice Johnson Dowd. Janice is not only the mother of 4 beautiful children, but she's also a recovering alcoholic on a mission to share her story and insights with the world. With over 2 decades of experience as a licensed master social worker, Janice blends her personal and professional life in her upcoming book, which is filled with insights about rebuilding relationships in recovery. In today's episode, we will hear about the struggles she faced and how today she lives out her best life sober. Welcome, Janice. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Can you just take us back to the beginning of your life, as far back as you want to go, up and until where alcohol began to shape your story differently, and what your life looks like today without it?
Okay, great. Well, I was a late in life drinker. I really didn't start drinking regularly until I was 40. That was primarily because I grew up in an alcoholic home and vowed I would never become an alcoholic or put my kids through what I went through. And so I became a social worker, and I worked in this field early in my career. I worked with families. I worked in inpatient and outpatient treatment centers working on the family side, which fueled my denial later on when I did start drinking. So in my 20s, I was working on a career. I did some Al-Anon and some other 12-step groups to help support my personal growth. And then I met and married my now ex-husband, and we had 4 children. So I spent my 20s career, 30s being a mom, and trying to balance career and parenthood. And the self-care started to slip away during that time. So I had, at age 40, I had 4 children under the age of 8. And it's easy to put yourself last as a mother, don't you think?
Yes, so true. Absolutely.
Yeah, because you think your children come first. So I found the easy fix of having a couple of glasses of wine while you're cooking dinner or at lunch with your girlfriends. And I told myself, I haven't had a drinking problem in the last 20 years. I'm good. I probably have skipped the gene. I believe in the disease concept and the genetic, what's the word? Tendency. So,
genetic predisposition.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so, I hung on to that denial until it was like painfully obvious that I was both emotionally and spiritually a wreck. I tried counseling, antidepressants, anti-anxiety, and sleeping medication and therapy again. And ultimately, I ended up in AA. And I went to AA. I loved it. At first, I was hugely ashamed and embarrassed because I had worked in this field. I still had a whole lot of denial about how much damage I had done to my kids and my family because I hadn't gotten like a DUI or none of the like painfully embarrassing public experiences. I did. I mean, I hate saying it, but I was verbally abusive to my kids at night because I did most of my drinking at home, and I'm really ashamed of that. And I had to make amends for it. But anyhow, so I didn't stay sober with AA alone. I went to treatment, and treatment changed everything. And I went to treatment thinking, okay, I'll be here for 4 weeks. We'll get some family therapy in. I'll go home and all I have to do is get sober and make an effort. And I was so wrong. So, you, I avoided dealing with the issues at home with my kids. At first, it was just denial, how much I'd harmed them. And then it was fear of their rejection. And then my old natural, like childhood instinct of being sweet and cheerful. My role in my family was the mascot. I was the only daughter. And so my role in that family was to distract, to be pretty, cute, all of that. And I fell back on that, which sounds crazy that a 50-year-old woman would be talking to her children like she was 12, just like them. It's crazy. But that's what I did. I did, while I was in treatment, embrace it. And I embraced it so much that I went from 4 weeks of treatment to 12 weeks of treatment. And
so you embraced recovery? Is that
yes,
what you mean? You embrace? Yes.
I embraced recovery and really working on myself, but not so much on the family situation.
Okay.
And on my roles with that. And the part I was playing in the family dysfunction, because it's a family disease. Everyone's impacted in one form or another. And by the time I hit 12 weeks, my relationships with my family, the divide there had grown to a bigger divide. Part of that was because I was in treatment 200 miles away from where they were, and they're all involved in sports and college. And my husband at the time was doing his best to juggle everything in his job. So they didn't make it up to the treatment facility very often. And when they did, I just bombed it. I did not take use of that time. So towards the end of treatment, they're like, we think you need to go to a halfway house. We don't think you'll stay sober at home, that there's too many triggers there. And so I did. I mean, at that point, I was like, whatever you tell me, I know I'm a mess. And I'd opened up some childhood wounds and some traumatic experiences that I had. And I knew I needed more help, more support. So I went to a halfway house. And during that time, I did nothing the first 3 or 4 months of my recovery outside of treatment, did very little to repair the relationships with my kids. And then, so I had an alcoholic bottom before I went to treatment. And then I had, and I want to say that this bottom, I mean, sometimes I say it was worse than my alcoholic bottom because it was more spiritually and emotionally pulling. But it's different. So it's an adult child of alcoholic bottom. And what happened was I got kicked out of my halfway house for something I didn't do. But it was definitely, it ended up being definitely one of the best things that ever happened to me because it made me open my eyes. I realized at the time I couldn't go home because they weren't ready for me. They didn't want me. There was a lot of anger and hostility. And then I lost my second home of the halfway house. If you can imagine, it was all women, and the women were either professionals trying to maintain their nursing medical licenses, or they were 20-somethings who I started to incorporate them as they were substitutes for my family. I mean, I treated a lot of those girls like they were my kids. So they had become my second family. And when I got kicked out of the halfway house, I lost that family too. So I found myself, figuratively homeless. My sponsor let me stay with her for 7 days and told me I had to figure it out. So I found another sober living home after being rejected a couple of times, which was hard. I mean, but it's all part of the process. All this negative experience actually forced me to look at what was going wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I wish I'd said that I had an aha moment then, but I didn't. I slipped into a really deep depression, and I just saw my situation as hopeless because I had been like the perfect 12-step recovery individual. I was doing everything right, working on my 4th and 5th steps, going to meetings, leading meetings, doing everything that was asked of me. And it still wasn't working. And I still had lost everything. And I want to step back for a minute. I remember when I first went to treatment, this is one of the things that helped me get through that period because it was dark. I remember that we had a young man come and, tell his story while we were in treatment. And part of his story was, I was like, okay, my life's okay now, but I want you to know that once that pink cloud dissipates, you may get struck in the face with, hard situations. And he talked about how himself at 6 months went through this, and his story was incredible. He found himself back in jail and he was desperately depressed. And then he talked about what he did to get through it, which was work the program one day at a time. He told on himself. I didn't tell on myself. He told people that he, just didn't want to live. And he got help and started working. But just knowing that this young man had gone through it helped me tremendously at that point. Mm-hmm. And although I was feeling really hopeless, I remembered him and him saying that he got through it. And if you just stay sober, do the work, that you'll get through it too. So I took and it was a month or 2 months that I was deeply depressed. And I really worked the program one day at a time. Get up in the morning and I would tell myself, I'm not going to kill myself today. When I got into those dark moments, I would remind myself that probably the most painful thing I could do to my kids would be to kill myself. So that was a huge motivation to start doing some of the deeper work that I had to. And so to get out of that, I began to look closely at my part in my family of origin, my part in what I was doing presently. And my therapist and I decided that we would actively look at my character traits from my dysfunctional family of origin, my ACA traits, and we work on those and examine how those traits still linger and impact in my relationships with them now. Does that make sense?
It sure does. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And thank you for sharing what you just did. I know that's difficult to say out loud, but it really speaks to alcoholism as a disease. And so if not treated and left untreated could be as deadly as if you were still drinking,
Absolutely. And I've seen, because I'm still very active in the 12-step program, still go to a lot of meetings. And there are a lot of suicides in early recovery. And a lot of, and I think people who aren't addicts don't understand. I think there's a lot of misconception about it. And there should be more study about the struggles that we take through, that we experience in early sobriety, which is part of what I wanted to talk about today. And so I'll switch to a more positive point in the terms of the tools that I used, if that works for you.
Yes, sure.
The most important tool, and this is definitely an experience of do as I say, not as I do, but is to tell yourself. I wish I had told on myself quicker.
If I could just interject for a moment, when you were speaking about that before, and you said you had listened to his story and he got through it and he had shared his secret, but you hadn't. And I thought, wow, like someone had told me once, hey, there's millions of people getting this and you're not. So what are you not doing? Because this works. And I
Mhm.
had to really say, hey, I'm carrying this around. I'm doing this. I'm doing this. I'm doing this. But I had to identify what it was I wasn't doing. And there
Mhm.
was certainly something, and that's really great because you're just so aware of that and you're sharing that. Like, yes, this is the first thing that you're identifying. You didn't
Yeah.
share everything.
It's huge. And that's kind of why I share it now, because I mean, life has its ups and downs. And because I've outed myself with it, it's never going to be a alternative for me in the future. Does that make sense?
Mhm. Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I when I was suicidal, I was desperately trying to find a way to kill myself that would look like an accident. But now that I've
Mhm.
shared this, my God, if I actually ended up dying in a car accident or something, I think there'd be some suspicion. But yeah, so telling on yourself is huge. I got help from the old timers in the program. I reached out to the woman that I went to treatment with, to their kids who were willing to talk to me, because not everyone has a family who's resistant to getting to welcoming you back.
Right.
So I would speak to their kids and say, what is it that you wanted? What is it that you needed? What do you think
Hmm.
I could do? And that was really helpful. And if nothing else, it was helpful that it gave me hope that I could see that, one of my friends and their children were, you know, working through exactly what I had gone through.
Hmm.
But some of
Hmm.
the key things that I did with my family is I began to get real. I
Hmm.
stopped being superficial. I asked them about their feelings. And I think one of the most important tools that I talk about in the book and that I use for them to use in general is to honor their feelings, to
Hmm.
accept that their feelings are valid no matter what, their opinions of certain situations are valid no matter what. I mean, I have instances that still come up where a child will go, "You're triggering me, mom, because that reminds me of the time that you did this." And of course, my natural instinct is to be like, "Oh, no, 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 I didn't mean it that way." But I've learned to pause and go, you're probably right. Tell me more about that. Tell me more about how you felt and
Hmm.
what happened. And sometimes it can be really painful, but most of the time it's very healing, because for the first time and I'm 10 years sober, the first time we've resolved an issue, no matter how big or small, it's just
Hmm.
one more issue that we put behind us that helps us to be stronger.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And by you doing that, you're essentially saying to them that what they have to say matters, and you're willing
mhm,
to listen. It's not just about me. It's about you.
right. And I think that's so, so important.
Hmm.
Um, One of the concrete tools that I started to do was just to make them more aware of the language and culture of AA, the 12-step programs I was participating in, because there'd be some confusion. I'd be like, "Oh, I got to drop everything. I've got to return this phone call to one of my friends." And they'd be like, "What? We're in the middle of dinner." And so I had to take time to explain, like, this person's in a crisis. It helps me to help them.
Hmm.
And it, I'm, I had to explain that I'm not taking away from them. So good communication in general is key,
Sure. Hmm.
and being honest. And in terms of being honest, one of the things that I think is really important, and I think almost every parent gets asked this, is you get asked, promise me you'll never drink again, or promise me that you'll never embarrass me in front of my friends again. And in my 12-step experience, we live in the present, we live in the day. And so I would be lying to them and to myself if I said, I'll never drink again. But so what I try to do in response is two things. One, ask them where this is coming from. What is your concern? And it may be something they may go, oh, because you did this behavior, which reminds me of this. So it helps me understand their feelings. And then I respond with, listen, here's what I've done today and what I'm doing daily to stay sober. And I'm going to do that again tomorrow. So I feel pretty confident that I'll be sober today and tomorrow. I cannot promise you anything because I don't want to ever mislead you again. And if you do relapse, or whether it's behavioral, because a lot of us experience dry drunks, I think it's important to be honest. I was at a meeting recently, and there's a man still early in sobriety, and he was talking about how his last drunk, like he'd been maintaining some periods of sobriety, and then don't know why, went out with a friend, drank, came home, and he was scared to death of his wife. And all she did was look at him and say, promise me you're going to go to a meeting tomorrow. She had grabbed enough of the program to understand that relapses happen. And he said he did not feel any desire to lie, to fake it, or any of those things. So, so they made it through it. So I think honesty is important, honoring your kids' feelings. I had to honor the anonymity. I went through a pink cloud for a while where I wanted to show everyone my key tags, and that made them uncomfortable. So I had to honor their feelings about that. There's a whole slew of things. I think probably the most important thing is that I maintain my sobriety.
Yes. And you had mentioned, you mentioned dry drunk. And so I'm familiar with that term, but perhaps listeners may not be. So can you explain what you meant by that?
So a dry drunk is essentially where you're not drinking, but you experience a lot of the characteristics of being drunk, of the behavior, whether it's like small little lies, being irritable, short-tempered, feeling very triggered over small things. It's basically, your life in chaos without the alcohol being the problem.
Right.
So, which is why I feel so strongly about continuing to work some type of program. And I said this recently too, that, I got sober through a 12-step program. I recognize and acknowledge there's other ways to do it.
Sure.
Maintain sobriety for you might be something different. It might be through your church. It might be through some other type of meditation, spiritual program. This is just what worked for me.
I agree with you. There are so many different ways that people have. Some woman just was on and she said, I'm not a recovered alcoholic. I'm not a recovered alcoholic. I'm a delivered alcoholic. And, and then so too, and the spiritual backgrounds have all been so vast and different. And I'd like this space, this podcast to honor all of them, because your story is your story. And each guest has their own, so yeah, I agree.
Great. I think the last point that I'd like to make that's really important is to have some compassion for yourself and to understand it's going to be 2 steps forward, 1 step back. There's, just like your sobriety goes up and down, there's good days, bad days. That happens in relationships as well. Especially once the closer the relationship, the more sensitive you are going to be to the ups and downs of it. So I think forgiving yourself is important. Making amends. I'm all about making amends. And I have a very detailed description in my book about how to make a good amends, because I feel strongly about that. I don't know. What are some other things that you can think of that I might have missed?
How much sobriety time do you have now? And I'm curious to see how your relationships within your home have changed since the very beginning of your recovery process to present day.
That's a great question. So I am over 10 years, approaching 11 years sober. And I want to back up and say, I grew up in a home that it wasn't horrific. It was dysfunctional. And, but I didn't learn good, healthy skills on how to be a parent in that home.
Sure. Okay.
So that's where some of the self-compassion comes in. But so my bar for what's a healthy relationship is nice and low. But I'm happy to say that I have amazing relationships. I will say this though, it took over a year and a half before before I could see any conscious headway with any of my 4 children. And
Yeah.
that was the child who's most actively involved in confronting me about my drinking. So
Hmm.
I like to think that helped because he got some of his anger out early. And then the other relationships, because each child's different, each one has different
Sure.
wounds. I didn't drink hardly at all for the older 2 children because I was pregnant with the younger 2. So they had a different early childhood than the younger 2 did. Um, but I also really want to point out that it was 4 years, and I cried a lot about this, about not being able to reach out to one of my kids. It
Hmm.
was hard and it was painful. And this is where it's important to have a sponsor or a therapist or someone who can give you that support and understanding and keep you on track and like never give up. So yeah, I going back to my family of origin, I never dreamt I could have relationships this good with my kids. I thought my role was to be an authoritarian and to guide them right and, you know,
Wow, that's great. So you
set them off.
completely flipped it.
Yes, I have great relationships with my kids. I'm a little codependent, and that, my daughter is one of my best friends, and my favorite travel or leisure time companions are my kids. And I probably should, well, kids are people in the program, you know, I probably should widen my expanses. And part of that's because, I want to make up for that time that I missed. But the relationships are great. And I want to give hope to anyone who's still struggling because it is possible. It just takes work and
to
time.
restore to restore everything. Do you
Mhm.
find, that saying, it says the people closest to us are usually the last to see us change. Is there any truth to that in your work?
Absolutely. Because, like your peers in the recovery program, they get it. They speak your same
Sure.
language. They can see, your sponsor can see the growth. But your family members are the most guarded and the most reluctant to look at it because they're still waiting for the other shoe to drop. They've
Mm,
got their boundaries up higher, and and that's okay. I mean,
yeah.
they've got the most to lose if I drink again.
Yeah,
So
they have the most to lose. I never thought of it that way. But
yeah,
sure, don't they?
hmm yeah, yeah.
So it is possible.
It is
And
very possible.
so how did you come to the point where you said, "Hey, I want to put this down on paper so that other people can benefit from my experience?" Can you talk a little bit about the book you have coming out?
Absolutely. So that evolved kind of naturally. I mean, at first I was asking for help from other people. And then, at meetings, I started to begin to share my positive experience. And then my one of my home groups does regular visits at one of the treatment centers in our town. And so every time I had the opportunity to speak there, that would be my topic. I'd be like, okay, how many people of you have kids?
Uh,
how many of you people have good relationships? Here are some things that I did. I want to give you hope. So it evolved naturally like that. And then my nature also is I love reading and researching. I started that in undergrad and graduate school. I worked as a teaching assistant or research assistant, and my sponsor being a teacher. I mean, I had a binder of paperwork that she had given or I had printed out, and it, and then COVID hit, and I was like, okay, I'm going to put this together in a concise way. And it became a book. I mean, people kept giving me feedback. I've spoken at a number of different conferences, and they're like, we love a book. So that's what I've done.
Great.
And it's not published yet. I hope that it will be by the end of 2024. But we're getting there. And I have a publisher seriously looking at it now. I'm hoping they'll give me a go by the end of the month. And if not, well, my agent and I will publish it independently. So
very good. Excellent. I can't wait to see it. And I can't wait to have you back on so that you can talk a little bit more about the book, and then we can offer it out to listeners on one of our monthly giveaways. That'd be so incredible. I don't know if you've ever seen this part or heard this part in the 12-step recovery about how women alcoholics are often far gone with less alcohol and less time. And I feel like that applies here because you didn't start drinking until you were 40 years old. And I have another friend that I do know who didn't start drinking until then. The effects on her were so quick that in less than a year, she was, knew she had a problem and just traveling, on subways and just, it was incredible, but that is stated. Do you see any truth to that?
Oh, absolutely. I definitely think that as women, and most of us are smaller, and just by the nature of our body size and everything, we're going to it's going to take less alcohol to give us a buzz or a drunk. I can't tell you exactly where I went from social drinking to alcoholic drinking, but I know at the end, my liver was affected. Your body gets to a point when you do liver damage that it takes less alcohol to get the same impact. Does that make sense?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
I think as women, we have to be careful. I started drinking out of that, like the mommy wine culture.
Mm-hmm.
And, like it was normal to go out for lunch and have a couple of glasses of wine, etc. Or we watch The Bachelor and have a couple of glasses of wine. And I got caught up in that. I did. I went through this period where I was like, hey, my kids, I'm no longer pregnant, breastfeeding. My life has evolved around my kids. I want to go have some fun. It was kind of a knee-jerk reaction. And I did some, girls' weekend trips and things like that. That was all about the drinking. I wish I hadn't gone that route, but I think we need to spread that word. And the nice thing, you probably have seen this too. I think there's a culture now that's very accepting of giving up drinking without calling yourself an alcoholic.
Yeah. There's definitely a different language than I'm used to in the last 20 years, for sure. And which I wasn't, when I first heard it, I thought, oh, well, that's not how I did it. And since being around a virtual community, which I think was an offset of COVID, we all got introduced to the Zoom meetings when COVID was here. And yes, they were using different language. And, but when you get to it and when you speak to them, it's all the same. It's just different language. And some of that language keeps people away, or some of it, causes judgment. Everybody's going toward the same ends, and that's to live a life free of alcohol and live well,
That was beautiful how you summed that up. That was very nice.
And true. It's just true. It's just been very true and refreshing to me because I've been silent for 18 years about my recovery because that's how I was brought up to be. And when it was very hard to step over that line for a number of reasons, you know.
Mhm.
I didn't want to violate anything, or I didn't want to, and ultimately it's difficult to put yourself out there. But when I did it, I've never looked back.
I absolutely agree with you. And timing is important too. I think COVID and all of that has made this much more acceptable. For me, I couldn't have come out and talked like this 5 years ago. My kids weren't ready for me to share what I share.
Sure.
So that has an impact too.
And to honor everybody's choices to do it or to not do it. You know, I couldn't do this less than a year ago.
Mhm.
So it's just how things change, you know, never say never.
Exactly. Yeah. The podcast, I mean, I think that offshoot came out of COVID as well, that people were at
Mhm.
home and trying to be creative. And this has just opened up so much more information.
Mhm.
Um, I listened to podcasts for a long time, and they just get better, and the information gets better, and the resources. I'm just thrilled that your podcast I've listened to so far just great. I've listened to the
Well,
first four.
thank you. Thank you
Mhm.
so much. Yeah. Thank you. You know, and two, as we're fellow writers together, part of getting your message to reach who you want to reach it to, it's important, as you know, to create that platform for it to kind of get out into the world. As a writer, you don't think you have to do that part. Like, isn't
Right.
that someone else's? But then
Yeah,
you find out, no, you do. And if you really believe in your message, then you'll go through the technicalities and the learning curve to get to where you need to be in order to get your message to where you want it to reach. So,
absolutely. I so identify with that because I I've spoken in front of groups forever for my job and then, with 12-step meetings and at conferences. But the concept of being on a podcast at first was very intimidating. And you
mhm.
know, I'm still an adult child of alcoholic and very self-critical of myself. I think that avenue to reach more people is just huge.
What do you think about, just lastly, or you know, if you had anything else on, because you grew up in an alcoholic home where you had your parents who were alcoholics, where do you, and you began drinking at 40. So
Mhm.
where do you land with that genetic predisposition as being a big factor?
I absolutely believe in the genetic predisposition. I mean, and my mom was not an alcoholic, but her father had been.
Okay,
And
I'm sorry.
it
Yeah.
was, well, no, it's fine. It was rampant through her family. And
Okay.
my dad was an alcoholic. He was, well, what you would call a functional alcoholic. And it's hard to say how far back in his family because his family's really spread out. But I know
Mhm.
that he had an uncle who died on the streets of Minneapolis because he was drunk and fell asleep, passed out. Um, so I know it's through his family too. And I warn my kids all the time, you know, you have to be
It's,
aware. You at least have my genes.
say we'll skip that generation. We're just going to skip right over it.
Let's hope. Let's
You know,
hope.
and it being one of the most difficult things, I would imagine you can agree, it being one of the most difficult things that I ever went through, but also the best thing that ever happened to me
Oh my
because
God.
of everything. You know.
Absolutely. I mean, I would have never developed this kind of close relationships with my kids if I hadn't become an alcoholic. I probably would have still had that I'm the parent, you're the child, you must listen to me
Yeah.
mentality. And the things that I've experienced in sobriety is just mind blowing, actually. So I have done everything from try out for the amazing race with my daughter to traveling about
Wow.
20 different countries with my kids
Mhm.
to, writing this book and talking on podcasts. My life is, I'm so blessed. I'm so glad.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's really, so you've been to 20 different countries with your kids in sobriety in the
I've,
last 10 years?
yes. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
some countries, one of my oldest son, he wanted to visit the micronations of Europe, which is like the Vatican City and
Mhm.
Monaco, and we did that. So just with him alone, we hit like 6 different countries. Switzerland.
Great.
It was crazy.
Go and see and do it all
Yeah,
because you
crazy.
can. You just have such like an appreciation too. I think when you get sober, you have such a deep appreciation for life because, as you had shared earlier, that you almost did not want to be here. And I remember hearing somebody speak once, and she was talking about a conversation she had with her niece, and she said her niece had come to her to share something with her. And she was so touched that she would come to her, but it wasn't the content of the conversation that floored her. It was the fact that as her aunt and as an active alcoholic for the majority of her life, that she was actually there to have it.
Right.
It just took her breath away, So there's something to it like that when you come out of that you have such a deep meaning and appreciation for life's moments, that would have otherwise been lost, I think, on most people.
Yes.
So that's an advantage.
It is. It's
and
a
a
huge
blessing.
advantage. Well, and plus, okay, so I don't want people to get me wrong. I am the queen of budget traveling. So I think also in sobriety, you appreciate the simple things as much. Like we are not staying at 5-star hotels. Sometimes we're staying in hostels with other 20-somethings traveling Europe. But it's experience. I appreciate experience so much more than things now.
Yes. That's great. Yeah, I can relate with that. I think that's wonderful. And good point too. Because when people come in, if they're listening and they say, well, I'll never be able to do that. I don't have any money, because we don't come in and get sober and we have everything in place. Everything's usually on the ground and broken apart. But the rebuild is so real, and the meaning is so deep that you don't need much and you can go far, so there's so much out there for everyone that stays on and just doesn't give up on themselves,
Absolutely.
Yeah. I really appreciate you coming on. Did you have anything else that you wanted to share?
I just want to give just hope. You can do this. It's hard, but you can do this. And the relationships you develop are so worth it. Don't give up.
That's great. Thank you so much for being here. And I really look forward to having you on. Would you come back when your book is published?
Absolutely. I'd love to.
If you'd like to learn more about Janice Johnson Dowd and her up-and-coming book, be sure to follow her on Instagram at parenting_in_recovery. Visit her website, www.janicejohnsondowd.com, for updates on the book's release and information about any upcoming speaking engagements. Thank you for tuning into the Sober Living Stories podcast. If you have been inspired, consider subscribing and sharing with anyone who could use hope in their lives. Remember to stay tuned for more inspiring stories in the episodes to come. To view our featured author of the month or to become a guest yourself, visit www.jessicastepanovic.com.